If you've ever had a relationship, known someone who was suffering from schizophrenia, you know that sometimes communication can be difficult, impossible. Schizophrenia often brings with it its own language, its own kind of logic. I believe that I succeeded in breaking through that with my cousin Barry in an intensely devastating time for our family. Now, Barry wasn't always schizophrenic. As is often the case with that disease, it set in when he was in his early 20s, and he appeared to have a perfectly normal childhood, and he and I were very close when we were kids. He was a good kid, handsome, fun to be around, articulate, much more socially poised than I was, and I admired him. He was the kind of kid who was kind, who would give up his turn at a game so that his cousin could play. When we got to the age of 19, 20, 21, it was the mid-60s, and we both tuned in, turned on, and dropped out. I was more into tuning into anti-war protests and civil rights marches. He was turning on to heavy-duty drugs, and we both dropped out into the Powelton Village neighborhood, the counterculture center of Philadelphia, where we grew up. That was around the time that the schizophrenia started to set in, the symptoms appeared. He got into some trouble, and I don't even know exactly what happened. His parents, my Uncle Eddie and Aunt Margaret, never said exactly what it was that led to his hospitalizations and the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. But he was hospitalized a couple of times, and if I saw him then, in that period, in the late 60s, at a family party, if my Uncle Eddie and Aunt Margaret brought him along, he would be, it was like nobody was home. He would be standing rigid with his back to a wall, always with his back to a wall, big head of hair and beard, not responding to anything going on around him, but with his eyes focused way in the distance, as though he was watching, tracking something that only he could see and hear. At that same time, in the late 60s, I was beginning a career in journalism. Insurance is my second or third career. I started out in journalism. And in 1970, I moved to New York City to take a job there. And I really didn't see Barry for about 10 years. I did hear from my mother in Philadelphia that he was doing better. I guess that new antipsychotic drugs had come along, and they made him more functional. He could live on his own in an apartment. He even had a job in a shoe store for a while. And in 1980, after I hadn't seen him for about 10 years, I went to a birthday party for my sister in the Philadelphia suburbs. And Eddie and Margaret were there, and they had brought Barry, and Barry and I got together and started to talk, and for a while it was just as though I had my old cousin back. He was fun to talk to. He was, I mean, I just couldn't believe how much fun he was to be with, until I mentioned something about murder. I had read recently that an old friend of ours from our Powelton Village days, a guy by the name of Ira Einhorn, had been arrested for the murder of his ex-girlfriend, Holly Maddox. She'd been missing for 18 months, and her body was found in a trunk in his Powelton Village apartment. So I said to Barry, oh, I understand we have a mutual friend who committed murder. Oh yeah, who? Ira. Oh, Ira didn't do that. The police say Ira did that. He didn't do that. Barry, what are you talking about? They found his ex-girlfriend in a trunk in his apartment. Yeah, I know, but Ira doesn't have the intellectual curiosity to do a thing like that. So if there could have been a thought bubble over my head at that moment, it would have said something like, I'm standing next to somebody who just equated intellectual curiosity and murder. This guy is not as much better as I thought he was, and I'm going to be a lot more comfortable if I move to another part of the room I am very uncomfortable standing next to him right now, and that's what I did. I've never been physically afraid around Barry, but I just couldn't stand there next to somebody who was talking about intellectual curiosity to do murder. 3 years later, I got one of those midnight phone calls that would change my life. The bodies of my Uncle Eddie and Aunt Margaret were found in their apartment in the Philadelphia suburbs. They had been shot to death. There were no signs of forced entry. There was $400 in cash, untouched in a dresser drawer. It looked like it very well could have been Barry who did it. I drove through the night to reach my mother in Philadelphia before she would wake up and run the risk of getting the news on the television or the radio that her brother, whom she depended on, had been murdered along with her sister-in-law, and that her nephew might have done it. She had been a widow for 25 years, and Eddie was her rock. And as I drove through the night, I kept thinking about Barry. If he did this, what was going to happen to him? And how was... I was just totally confused about how to think about Barry in that context. I certainly didn't hate him. He was sick, I know that, but he just killed his parents, I think. And I did reach my mother and met up with my brother and sister, and we went to the home where the family was gathering at that time, the home of my Aunt Margaret's sister, May. And as I walked in the door, there was Barry greeting me in the doorway. And I hugged him, all the time thinking, what am I doing? I'm hugging this person. I have no warmth, no feeling here. I'm comforting someone who I think probably just killed his parents. Later that afternoon, I was at the crime scene with the police, and I was able to ask them some questions, and I learned that when my Aunt Margaret was shot, she was sitting in her pajamas, sitting on a sofa in the den, with a TV tray in her lap, mating socks. She died with that tray still in her lap, with a sock unmated still over her left hand. It just couldn't, there was nobody else who could have been in that situation and able to kill her in that, shoot her in that situation there. So I really knew it had to be Barry, but it took the police 4 more days before they arrested him, which meant that here we were attempting to mourn 2 people we loved in the presence of somebody else we loved whom many of us thought had killed them, and whom I was pretty sure had, pretty close to 100% sure had done it. And I felt a responsibility as somebody who had been so close to him in the past, a responsibility to confront him. I couldn't sit there and just listen to him say, which he did at one point, what a great humanitarian his father was, without confronting him about what he had done and asking him to turn himself in. And I felt like I should say, Barry, let's take a walk around the block. You know what? I think you did this, and I really wish you would turn yourself in. It would be a favor for all of us if you did that. But I didn't have the courage to do that. Instead, I did something that seems to me much more cowardly, but that just may have worked. We were alone in May's living room after the funeral in the afternoon. No one else was around for a minute, and I said, Barry, how's your intellectual curiosity these days? And when I said the words intellectual curiosity, it was like a shock had hit him. He went, ugh! And so I figured I was onto something, and I kept using the phrase. I said, you know, Barry, your intellectual curiosity, you told me once about your intellectual curiosity. Have you exercised your intellectual curiosity lately? And finally he said, intellectual curiosity, that's too big a word. I don't understand that word. Now, intelligent, that's a word I understand. Intelligent means somebody tells you to do something and you do it. That's intelligent. The next day, Barry was arrested and he confessed. In his confession, he said that he heard the voices of nuns coming to him over the television, ordering him to kill his parents. He turned off the television, but the voices wouldn't stop. So he put 3 bullets into his mother and 3 bullets into his father. Intelligent means somebody tells you to do something and you do it. That's intelligent. Barry accepted a plea bargain, and after spending the next 11 years in prison, at the age of 50, he hung himself in his cell. I believe that's the only way he had to make the voices stop forever.